Chain Drug Review and Mass Market Retailers Video Forum. Brought to you by the Emerson Group.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Wolt, Editor-in-Chief of Chain Drug Review and Mass Market Retailers. Welcome to our video forum. Today, we're thrilled to have as our guest Mike Wysong, CEO of CARE Pharmacies and the incoming chairman of the National Association of Chain Drugstores. Mike, great to have you with us.
Jeff, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time to spend a few minutes with me here this morning.
For many years, we've been interested in your work at CARE Pharmacies, which is a great success story. Today, our subject, though, is NACDS. You unexpectedly were elevated to the chairman's role a year early in light of the departure of Andre Prasad from Rite Aid. Maybe you can tell me how that's been and how eager you are to take on the job on short notice.
Well, Jeff, I can tell you it's always an honor when you're working with people that put you in line for the leadership. And, you know, one of the things we know is that change is constant. And I'm fortunate enough to have been surrounded by some pretty good people. And even though I'm entering my chairmanship a year early, I think I'm ready to do that and prepared. And as they say in the military, next man up.
It's NACDS's 90th anniversary. And over those 90 years, the role of the association has evolved and changed. What do you see the primary mission as being today?
Well, I think anytime you contemplate celebrating 90 years, that's a critical mass of time. And I think if you go back to 1933, you had a group of people that got together and recognized that there was strength in numbers and that we were better off together than divided. And so, you know, when I contemplate 90 years and the mission of the organization today, it's consistent with what it was back in 1933, which is to push a pro-patient, pro-pharmacy agenda, and to do that, you know, in the common good with the collective spirit of the group and their best interest in mind.
You would agree, though, I assume that lobbying in Washington and the states has become a bigger deal than it was 90 years ago.
Well, I would say so. I mean, it'd be hard to say that politics and the infrastructure and the dynamic nature of it today isn't it a fevered or frenzied pitch. That's for sure. One of the things that you probably can't argue is the impact that government has on all of us, regardless of your political ideology or persuasion. And so, you know, making sure that we're proactive in our grassroots efforts, both at the state and federal level, and then across all the branches of government, I think are really critical for being able to push that agenda.
As you look to begin your one-year term in April, what are your top priorities?
Yeah, so I think it's I almost say it's almost self-evident. You know, I'm fortunate to come on the heels of some pretty great leadership from Brian Nightingale. So one of my first priorities is to make sure that I continue the great work that Brian pushed forward here in terms of a lot of the DIR reform, the PBM transparency stuff, and obviously those two things are tied together. I'm actually feeling pretty good about it. When we had our RX Impact Day down in DC a couple of weeks back, there was clearly a growing bipartisan support just in some of the meetings that I was in around what DIR is, what it's causing, you know, the challenges that it's presenting to pharmacies in terms of the stability of the caregivers that are being impacted by that. So I would say that's really the first thing, is to continue to try to you know, address that and move that forward in some meaningful way. You know, when I think about NACDS in general, I always think about this collective pride when I go to the meetings. You know, working collaboratively with shareholders and making sure that as we contemplate really addressing some of the systemic issues here within pharmacy, that through the Health and Wellness Initiative of 2023, that we continue to work in good faith and to attract new people to really try to figure out how to close some of those gaps in care. So I would say that's a very high priority in terms of some of the things that I'm thinking about. And then again, maybe one of the most obvious ones is, you know, pharmacy really stepped up during the pandemic at a time when our country needed it most and our patients needed it most. And I think there really is a foundation that has been set there to continue to lobby on behalf of pharmacy access and making sure that the access that patients have become accustomed to having today, that they continue to have that moving forward as we look at ways at continuing to address some of these larger healthcare issues.
I want to drill down on a couple of those things that you mentioned, but maybe you could begin by just talking a little bit about the overall political climate, I guess, starting in Washington.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever seen anything quite like it. And I always say, man, I'm not sure it could get more dynamic or more interesting. And yet I'm proven wrong every time I hear those words come out of my mouth. I mean, there's no question that you have a hyper partisan, environment happening today in DC. I think if you're an association like NACDS trying to move these reforms forward, then you really have to take a comprehensive all branches of government approach, right? So it's making sure that you understand who the influencers are there, continue to build consensus across all the various levels of government, in spite of the what appears to be some lack of continuity between both branches of government working collectively in good faith. I say I'm pragmatically optimistic about our ability to do that. Like I said, if you've spent any time on the Hill, you get a pretty good sense that the key politicians and influencers at both the state level and the federal level understand the role and importance of pharmacy. So in spite of the daily news cycle of what you're hearing today, I still feel optimistic about our ability to push forward and move these key priorities and initiatives to some sense of completion.
Is the situation at the state level more favorable than it is in Washington at this point?
I think in some places it is. I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned is that, at a federal level, sometimes it's hard to take up a key initiative and run that across the entire platform, as opposed to kind of working at the state level. And then you can see the precedent state with it, the precedent set within certain states, and then that tends to be a little easier to pick that up at the federal level. NACDS, I think, has been very strategic in the way that they've approached this, and I mentioned kind of that all branches of government approach at all levels. When you do that, you're able to connect and build consensus, I think, much quicker around those key issues across multiple, hierarchies of people. And to be able to push that legislation along much faster. So we're working very intimately at the state level in key places, and then I think obviously we're being pretty deliberate in our touch points up at the federal level.
Going back to PBMs and DIR reform, what role can NACDS play? What more can NACDS do to try and get Congress to act and put some meaningful reform in place?
So I think that there, again, is consensus around what the DIR impact is having on critical care providers and communities that need access to those providers, and the ability to those providers to drive favorable outcomes and reduce some of the unsustainable costs of healthcare. I think that the association has really decided to take the approach of being readily available to work with the FTC on answering any of the questions that it may have in terms of the application of the DIR, the implication of that, to help pose maybe the question of the question, or maybe making sure that they understand which questions really need to be answered, so that you really end up with some sort of comprehensive DIR reform and not just bits and pieces of it. And that the intended consequence of that reform is favorable for the patients that will be on the receiving end of something that's much more of a transparent process than what it is today. So I think, being proactive and available and accessible, I would say, would be the key things that we will want to do as an organization as this thing continues to take shape and hold.
You mentioned the pandemic, and of course, the pandemic emergency is going to be over within a few weeks. What are the chances of getting some of the authorities that pharmacy was granted during the pandemic extended and made permanent?
I think they're good, but your previous question about politicians being distracted with the daily news cycle is clearly going to be a challenge for us in terms of taking advantage of that. Making sure that we codify the PrEP Act at the state level and continue to look at telling the pharmacy story, I think, is really going to be a critical component of us. I always say when people ask us what our long-term and strategic plans are, we try to boil that down into figuring out how to organize larger chaos in the service of customers. I think when you look at the lessons learned out of COVID, the way pharmacy rallied and was available and accessible to really address that, the uncertainty of that, I think is demonstrative of the role that pharmacy really could play moving forward in terms of organizing larger chaos in the service of customers. especially when you look at the number of customers that are coming into that point of their life where they're going to need access to primary care. So I feel good about that. Like I said, some of the things that are going on in DC today may look like impediments at the particular moment, but I think, given 90 years, I think as the incoming chair, I have an obligation to make sure that at the end of my term, the next chairman comes in and says, hey, it was left better than when I took over 12 months ago.
As you know, there have been situations in the past where pharmacy has stepped up and played an important role. I think of the rollout of the prescription drug benefit under Medicare, for example. And then once that work is done, pharmacy sort of recedes into the background. What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again this time?
So I mentioned the 2023, health and wellness initiative. Again, I think, historically, and this is my perspective on it, Jeff. I think, as care providers and givers, we're triaging the patients when they come in for their medications after the problem has already happened or they already have the issue. I think really looking at addressing some of the systemic issues that are driving some of these health disparities and some of these health-related issues are really done by taking an overall view of how do we head the problems off before they ever even begin. And so the NACDS 2023 initiative, I think, is really intended to do a lot of that, to take advantage of some of the lessons learned there, to really, be properly positioned here for the next wave of what I think pharmacy has to offer for consumers and patients alike.
Mike, as NACDS members increasingly expand their reach and role in healthcare, how does the association need to adapt?
The association has to remain faithful to its original charter, right? So it's got to go back and make sure that it's promoting pro-patient, pro-pharmacy agenda. But it has to be able to refine its philosophy based on where pharmacy was then and where it is now. There's clearly going to be innovation around a more comprehensive approach to patient care. You're already beginning to see that. The innovation that's coming out from both the technology perspective, just the integration attempts that are being made, I think are really indicative of where all of this is going to go. And it's going there in an attempt to really do a better job of providing or presiding over the patient-provider relationship. I think when you are in that position, you're able to have a much greater impact on outcomes in terms of compliance and adherence, and to really kind of head off some of these issues before you end up treating them. So I think the implication is the association has to continue to be innovative and dynamic, and not only recognizing where pharmacy is today, but where it's likely going to go. And my sense is that when you look at the technology and the tipping point, I mean, this thing is moving along very quickly, and the association will have to make sure that it moves as quickly.
NACDS understandably spends much of its time and attention on pharmacy and healthcare. Where does that leave the front end suppliers? How can the association do more to involve that part of the membership?
I think if you look at, you look at the last question you asked me, I think this is an extension of that. The consumer product group companies, there's a lot of innovation there. We look at like Total Store Expo and what's happening there and the opportunity for front end providers to come together. That is a great place to do that. I think about the work that the Retail Advisory Board does. Many people may not be aware of that group. I had the good fortune of sitting in on a couple of the Retail Advisory Board meetings here over the last year, and they were fantastic in terms of the collaboration that was happening there. We talked about emerging markets, crypto, the metaverse, a lot of these places where we have emerging technologies and I think some corresponding opportunities there. Those meetings were held across a wide geography, so and the ability to get in and out isn't an impediment to that. So I think the organization is acutely aware of the importance of what's going to happen out in the consumer product group category and their integration and importance in terms of really filling in some of those gaps of care and making sure that we're properly positioned as an association through their involvement.
Well, they're exciting times, and you certainly have a lot on your plate, but I'm confident you'll do a great job. Good luck.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm honored and ready to serve, and look forward to the meeting coming up here.